with the version 1.12, which is the one that's currently visible, everybody should be familiar with this. This is pretty much how the standards have looked for a couple of years now. Down the bottom there, you've got the CDR register link, and that takes you to the CDR register content. Jared, it might be good actually to just show the CDR register standards as well.
Okay, popping that open.
And everybody should be familiar with this, so it's the link on the far left. Yep. It's more just to get in everybody's mind, this is what's here. So on the CDR register, the ACCC team have done a fantastic job of maintaining this, obviously for a long time, and there's a lot of content here. So the job that Mark, Ivan and I have been working through over the last few weeks is how to merge these two sites together. That's the first thing to address. So there's a lot of content in both, and there's actually a lot of overlap. And part of that overlap was because the two had different trajectories. You know, we're just operating independently, but mainly the reason for overlap was because if someone's reading this page, constantly flicking back and forward with the CDR standards is a bit of a pain. And so sometimes it's just easy to say, to clarify things in context on both sides of the equation. So what we've been finding is there's actually a lot of statements that were very consistent, but there's a lot of statements that are in both pages. There's also a lot of stylistic changes, you know, just, way things are represented, language, etc., etc. So the majority of what we've been doing with 1.13 has been merging these two sites together to make the content consistent, so that it reads like one document and it doesn't read like a patchwork. So maybe if we go to 1.13, Jared. Now, everybody should have access to this link in the chat, I believe, or through the agenda.
So it's in the chat there.
Yeah, perfect. So this is in our standard staging. If you would like, it's in release branch, release V1.13.0. So you can actually go and do a diff, see all the changes that have occurred. You can actually see that we've actually changed not just the markdown and the swagger, but we've also changed the scripts we've used to create these, because we're introducing two new swagger files that were previously maintained on the CDR register site. So it's quite a substantial modification. But the other thing we found in trying to merge the two sites together is that it was difficult to read. The table of contents was just becoming unwieldy. So one of the first things that people who are familiar with the standards will notice is that we've actually changed the structure of the documents somewhat. We've modified the table of contents, added in separators to just cover areas that are related. We have moved things around. Standards has been renamed high-level standards. And so there's a few things like that, and I'll go through the table of contents to explain why we've done that. But the first thing I want to say is, for version 1.13.0, there are no material changes for the implementing banks, hence no future dated obligations. And when I say that, the intent of the register decision, and if you read the decision document, you will see this, is that it is to merge the documents together, but not change the standards. There is no intent here to change the meaning of the standards. It is inevitable that in such a large overhaul and merging of text that fallible humans, and I am the king of fallibility, will make mistakes. So we are looking to the community to highlight things. They will not be deliberate mistakes. We're not trying to sneak anything in. There will not be an intention to change the standards. But we are looking for people to highlight, hey, I think you may have got this wrong. What about this? You know, that kind of thing. And you can do that through questions on the CDR portal or through issues on the standard staging itself. So there should be nothing in this that has any implementation requirement for the banking sector. That includes the banks that have already gone live, but it also means for the banks that are aiming to go live in the near months. And there is no future dated obligation also. Okay. So I just want to get that out of the way first, because I set people's minds at ease. We're actually going through 13 and 14 rapidly. Effectively, 13 and 14 are not two versions. It's actually part 1 and part 2 of the energy standards. And it's just a practicality of trying to get as much change out as quickly as possible that we've done it in 2 published versions. It just makes it a bit easier. But in essence, 13 and 14 are not 2 versions. They're part 1 and part 2 of bringing the register and the energy decisions into the standards. Okay, so looking at the table of contents, we now have an introduction section. We've moved some of the commentary around in here, but there's no real difference. We have cleaned up the future dated obligations, which took the opportunity to take out some of the obligations that were well and truly past now. But in essence, there's very little change here. The high level standards has been renamed, but there's no change here. We renamed it simply to make it easier to read and clarify. It's having it just called standards in the past meant, well, what's the rest of the document? It was a bit confusing, so we just renamed it slightly. I don't believe we've changed anything in here that's material. There might be a couple of tweaks in language in here, particularly around headers, but pretty much there's minimal change here. If you go down to customer experience, we've actually elevated customer experience and it was a bit further down. So we've put it up a lot higher and given its own separation there. So it's very clear, here's the customer experience. But other than that, there's no change in this version for the CX section at all. Security profile is where the bulk of the change is here. So what we've done here, if you just scroll up a bit, Jared, so that the table of content compresses, you'll see that up a bit further so it compresses. If you scroll up the white bit, perfect. Yeah, so you'll see here there's 4 major sections now in together. So we've got security profile, DCR APIs, register APIs, and authorization scopes. So authorization scopes was well down the table of contents because it was added in later. We've brought it up and made it all together. So now if you scroll down a bit, it'll blow up the table of contents. You'll be able to see it a bit better. Yeah, so within the security profile, this is where the bulk of the registry content has gone, and I'll deep dive into this in a moment. But if we scroll past this and you just go on the left-hand side of the table of contents a bit further down, we'll see here there's then non-functional requirements has its own section. We then have all of the resource APIs together, banking, common, schema, admin. We did this deliberately to make a separation between the resource APIs and the security endpoints, including DCR and the register APIs. So if you like, we now have a clear separation in the standards between resource APIs doing designated data that have to be hosted by the data holders and security or facilitation APIs that are used for dynamic client registration, communicating with the register for statuses of data recipients and software statuses to support dynamic client registration and consent management, and the security endpoints. So the banking APIs and the common APIs are down here. In version 1.14, you will see energy APIs added to this section, and that will be the bulk of the changes coming next week, will be the addition of energy APIs, because most of the decisions we've yet to incorporate are to do with payloads and endpoints for the energy sector. You'll then see we've got a new section called secondary responsibility. I will come to that and explain in a moment. We've then got the administration, known issues, changelog, archives. If we click on known issues, you'll see that we have called out some known issues. As we were going through merging the code together, we came upon various things where it was hard to get alignment. The way Swagger was done was slightly different. Field names were slightly different, particularly the field type definition, things like that. Because we were trying to do a like-for-like transition, we have not arbitrarily gone and changed APIs, field types, changed something from snake case to camel case, because that would be material change. So instead, we've identified these things. They're in the known issues list, and we'll probably take them into decision proposals for consultation or into standards maintenance to work through those known issues and resolve them. At the moment, these known issues are not considered defects. The standards work fine. We're just highlighting the fact that we recognize there's some inconsistencies because of history here. Then in the bottom, the footer of the table of contents, you'll see that we no longer have the reference to the CDR register. That's because that content is now incorporated. Okay, so that's pretty much the overall structure that we've now moved to. Again, I might pause and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, I think I got one question that I could think of, James. So if I'm a data holder or data recipient and I've got links referencing old sections of the up to version 12 of the consumer data standards, will they still work when we publish version 13 tomorrow?
And that's a good question. It is not guaranteed. You'll still end up at this page, but the anchors may not be there. So the likelihood is that if you've got an old anchor, then it might just pop to the introductory section because the anchor's is not viable anymore. However, I'm pretty sure pretty much the only existing anchor we would have changed is probably high level standards. So instead of hash standards, it's probably hash high dash level dash standards now, because that's pretty much the only high level table of contents item we've renamed. Pretty much everything else should be the same. Obviously, if you've got any links to the CDR register, they won't be carried into here. It's a fundamentally different site. So any of those links will still point to the old ACCC CDR register, which will be frozen in time. If in effect, we're doing effectively here what we did with the InfoSec profile for those that have been around for more than 2.5 years, where we're maintaining that for history's sake and because of audit trails and so people, if they wish to, they can go back and see where decisions were made in the history, but we will no longer be editing that, enhancing it, modifying it, etc. So it'll be sort of frozen at a point in time. So those links may still work, but you really need to redirect them to this site. Does that answer the question, Jared?
It does. Thank you.
I might jump now into the information security section and go through the main changes we've got here. So that's under security profile. Thanks, Jared. So under the security profile, pretty much it's all the same, except there's two new sections here, client registration and participant statuses. Before we go into those, though, we have modified some other areas minimally. So what we've been finding is, as we were merging this code together, was some of the definitions needed to be modified. So the existing standards would say, hey, go and look at the register. So we've obviously had to modify that and actually put text in saying, don't go into it. It's no longer relevant to say, go and look at the register. It's all here. So we've actually expanded that explanatory text somewhat. So we have made minor changes to CDR Federation. We've made minor changes to client authentication. So if you click on client authentication, Jared, thank you, and scroll to the bottom of that section, you'll see that the data holders calling data CDR register and the CDR register calling data holders section have been expanded somewhat. So it's this part here. We've added some content in here that was on the register side. And there was an identifiers section, which we've now got in that little aside there, as well as in other places. So there have been some changes here. There have been some changes in the Federation section, and pretty much just a little tweaking of language. We've also tried to use this as an opportunity to go through and synchronize the term data recipient, the term registrar, remove references to the ACCC, unless it's introducing the concept that the ACCC is the registrar. So we've tried to refer to the CDR registrar as a role rather than the ACCC as a role, things like that. So it is not to say there is not changes all throughout. There have been little tweaks, but they should be non-material. If you can scroll down to the client registration section, which is next. Thank you. So this is the whole section on dynamic client registration now. So this is the area now that explains the SSA, the flow. One of the things that was really valuable on the CDR register site was a series of sequence diagrams. As per the process we've had for the CDR standards, we've found in the past that sequence diagrams can be misinterpreted as normative. So we have taken those sequence diagrams out, but we don't want to lose that value. So we're going to actually put those into a guidance article. And we have been working on updating the sequence diagrams that Brian Kirkpatrick previously created for the consent flows. So we'll be updating those as well and putting them into the CDR portal. So they're not gone, they're just not going to be included in the standards. But this section talks about client registration. If we scroll down and go past this into participant statuses, this is now the section that, and we have included, we've retained the diagrams for statuses because they're not in the main body, they're on the example side there, but they're also, in looking at them, they are aligned to the normative statements, so there's not the level of ambiguity. And we've had feedback that they're very valid, they're good diagrams anyway. So we have retained those, but this section is pretty much unchanged from the CDR register apart from just tweaking language, and represents the way statuses are maintained. If you're used to looking at the CDR register site and you go through and read this, you will note that we have taken out some statements which are more implementation specific. So the CDR register site was also including things like how you use the register or how the register maintains internal structure relationships between legal entity and software package IDs, things like that. They are concerns for the register, not for the register standards for data holders and recipients talking to the register and vice versa. So wherever there's something which is important for the register, but not important for the communication and interactions between participants, we have left that in the domain of the register team. So some of the statements we've taken out, it's not because they are no longer valid or true, it's because they're not really appropriate for the CDR standards. They're actually appropriate for the registrar to publish on their own site. So again, if you don't see something in here, it's either a defect or a deliberate omission because it was not considered that they should be part of the standards. If it's not an indication that what was previously said is no longer true or valid or helpful or useful. Okay, so if we scroll past down to, if we click on DCR APIs down the bottom there, Jared. We have retained the DCR swaggers, we've brought them across. We have not modified them in any way except to make them work within our version of Slate here. We have tweaked them a little bit, I think, just to get them to work with our processes, but no material change, definitely no structural change, no schema changes, etc. But these are the DCR APIs that people will be used to having to implement. And then underneath these DCR APIs, you'll find the register APIs, which are the APIs for the communicating status of data recipients, data holders, software packages, etc. And again, this has been incorporated into our build process, but we have retained as much of the descriptive text as humanly possible because it was really good stuff. The only other change to highlight is that in the authorization scope section, which is just below the register API section, we pretty much haven't made any change, but there is a scope in here, but we have separated the scopes out to make it a bit more clear what they're for. So there was a public statement, it was just another table, it's not really a scope. So we separated that out, showing that there is no scopes, public is public. Then we've got a section on CDR data. So these are the scopes that are for resource APIs to get actual CDR data, which you'll be familiar with if you've been building the resource APIs. And then if we scroll below that, there's a section on admin and registration. And this is where the scopes for things like metrics, metadata update, but also the CDR registration static scope, which is for the DCR process, is also listed. We've kept that separation so that there's a reduced confusion between the scope types. In essence, you should not be mixing these scopes. Where these scopes are used, they should not be in the same tokens as the CDR data scopes, for instance. And there were previously statements both in the standards and in the CDR register that was the case. We've hoped that this makes that a bit clearer. And I think that's pretty much the end of the changes for the register. We will take requests anywhere, but the three main mechanisms would be the CDR portal. So if you notice something is wrong but you're uncomfortable with GitHub, feel free to just drop in a request into the CDR portal and say, hey, you guys, I think this might be wrong. A bit like what Rob did before. That was really helpful. If we know about these things, we can fix them. The second path is in standard staging. And I'll pause here so that I won't go too fast because that way Jared can't keep up.
Oh, you want standard staging? Sorry, I went to maintenance.
Yeah. I'll do standard maintenance first. So the other way of doing it is standards maintenance. So if you think that there's a change required, raise a change request on standards maintenance. That's a normal process we have. So also, if you think now that everything's together, if you think something actually should be changed, actually now I see it all together and something should be changed, standards maintenance. And as you can see, there's many people engaging with standards maintenance to raise change requests. And we go through, and both Ivan and Mark mentioned maintenance iteration 9, which is underway. We take those things very seriously and they do end up changing the standards. And the third path is, sorry to make you jump around, Jared. Third path is standard staging itself. So this is a repo. This is where we stage the changes before we publish them. Ivan quite rightly said, hey, we're still tweaking stuff. This is where we're tweaking it. In fact, Ivan, Mark and myself have a meeting straight after this to actually start going through and what do we need to tweak here. If you raise issues on here, it's just like raising an issue on any open source project. We will take that as feedback. Now, if we go to the secondary responsibility section, so version 1.13.0 also has some energy decisions in it, specifically 19. Can we just look in the changelog? I get the numbers mixed up sometimes. There's too many on the go at the moment. I think it's 192 and 3 or 191 and 2. Yeah, so 191 and 2. So effectively, this is AEMO InfoSec and AEMO endpoints. These are, for those that haven't been looking at the energy sector, if you've been in the banking community, you may not have kept across what's happening in the energy sector. But in the energy sector, there's been a new concept introduced called secondary responsibility requests. And this is where there are two designated data holders, one which is facing the accredited data recipient and one which is known as a secondary data holder, which will service requests for CDR data through the primary data holder. So in effect, in the energy sector, energy retailers will be operating exactly like the banks for most of the data, but for 3 data clusters, if they get a request, they will then pass that request on to AEMO, who is the designated holder. AEMO will supply that request and pass it back. This section covers that. So there's 2 main parts under energy. There's the security profile section, which describes the security profile for a retailer calling AEMO. In essence, the decision that has been taken is to delegate this to the existing mechanisms that AEMO uses to manage connections to retailers already. So that's what that section basically does. So it's a very short security profile, and that's simply because we are delegating to a normative standard that is maintained separately. We also then have a section on the endpoints they will be presenting. The decisions was to align wherever possible with the APIs that the retailers as the primary data holder will present to data recipients. So rather than have a swagger here, we have called out variations to what will be done by the data holders. We may introduce a swagger, but we can't introduce the swagger yet because we need to introduce the decisions for the data clusters affected, DER usage and NIMI standing data. Until we actually get them into the standards with their own swagger, there's no point creating the swagger just for this. So we'll do that first. Next week, we'll bring in the swagger for the endpoints and payloads. And then after that, we may add a swagger here for AEMO as well, if there's demand for it. Technically, these statements here suffice. You can refer to the main standards endpoints and then use these as variations, if you like, to that swagger, and that's definitive. However, just for the sake of clarity, it may be useful to have its own swagger that we maintain. So this section is not related to the register. It is purely related to the energy sector. So when I said at the beginning that there's nothing in here for the banks to worry about, this section here is not for the banks. It's for the energy retailers, and potentially down the track, any future sectors that also have this pattern of a primary and secondary data holder. So we've made it generic because we're not just assuming that energy will be the only sector that has this. And the rules that are being formulated for the energy sector are also including cross-sectoral statements around this pattern as well. If we scroll to the top of this section though, Jared, you can see, well, actually I haven't done this. I've actually got this. I haven't checked it in yet. There will be a statement for this section saying that this section is non-binding. The decision at the moment is anything that's purely energy related will be put in as non-binding until the energy sector rules are finalised, and then the data standards chair will review a decision to make the energy sector standards binding after making sure they are aligned to the final rules. This section will have that declarative statement at the beginning. And that's pretty much all I had to go through. I'm happy to take questions.